That's fine. Okay, wonderful. All right. Well, hello, everyone. My name is Maddie Nickel. I am the Assistant Director of Alumni Engagement. I see some familiar faces and names here tonight, which is great. But for those of you who are new to our event series, this is the third event in a 5-part event series in partnership with Penn Nursing and Project Knitwell. We've been hosting events since September, and we'll go through February with some monthly events on different topics with knitting and fiber arts, things like that. If you haven't been able to make some of our previous events, recordings are available on our website, so you're always welcome to go to our site and find those recordings there. Before I hand things over to Lauren for our presentation tonight, just as a reminder, you're always welcome to turn your camera on, off, whatever you're comfortable with, but you also can utilize the chat for questions throughout the entire event. And you're also welcome to unmute and ask your question out loud too, if that's something you would prefer. I'll do my best to moderate the chat and share those with Lauren as we go. But of course, as I mentioned, feel free to unmute and jump in too if you have any questions. But with that, I'll hand things over to Lauren to get us started.
Great. Thank you so much, Maddie. I'm so happy to be here and to see some familiar names. I'm really excited tonight to talk a little bit about what can knitting provide us in terms of a challenge, right? So there are always challenges. There are always little sticky wickets, as I call them, and mistakes are just design elements, right? So every mistake is actually a technique. So tonight we're going to talk a little bit about the basics. We'll go through some of the common mistakes that beginners face, which I think sometimes even those of us that are experienced knitters, it's good to think back on some of the simple, real basic truths to the anatomy of a stitch. We'll talk about yarn substitutions. We'll get into some of the details on gauge and swatching, which I know some jokes out there are that knitters never really swatch, right? But if you do, what are the benefits? So we'll talk a little bit about that and how that works. And then we'll also dig into some detail work. So what are some really interesting decorative stitches, jogless stripes? So we'll talk a little bit about techniques related to a little bit from a stitch dictionary perspective. And hopefully those of us that have fine-tuned our knitting will learn something new. I'm going to go ahead and double check the chat here. Let's see. Oh, Maddie can help handle. I'm going to go ahead and put our Padlet in the chat. And the best part about this Padlet that I'm going to share with you tonight is that you can dig into each of the resources that I share. Everything is linked on the Padlet. And the nice part about it is it gives you a chance to dig in deeper after we have this conversation. If there's something you want to refer back to, each of the columns in the Padlet can scroll. I think of this as a bookshelf of different opportunities to click in and learn more. So I'm going to start here and present it as a slideshow. I represent Project Knitwell, and we're so happy to be in partnership with Penn Nursing to share with you some of the well-researched benefits on the therapeutic benefits of knitting. There recently was another study that just came out about slowing the onset of dementia from the Alzheimer's Association using rhythmic crafts and specifically knitting. So slowing the onset of dementia by up to 50%, according to a 2012 Mayo Clinic study. The Creativity Cure, which is a book with its tag phrase, How to Create Happiness with Your Own Two Hands, where the authors describe that 60% of the surface area of our brains is committed to the function in our hands. And bimanual activities like knitting, which create bimanual, meaning that you're using both hands rhythmically, can help create new neural pathways. And this is really powerful research. And I think really important to think about knitting as more than just a hobby. It's something that really is good for you. And using our hands more is something that I'm particularly passionate about. We can shape and build our minds. Frank Wilson's book, The Hand, which I really feel is a wonderful look at the anthropology and the sociology behind how we've used our hands throughout time. It talks about how ancient cultures would use worry stones and mala beads and other comforting tools in a rhythmic way. And knitting is really very similar to the way that you would use those types of, the way that you would use your hands and your fingers to engage in that way. So I'd invite you to take a look at that resource at some point and really think of knitting as a way to exercise your brain and your hands at the same time. Uh, there is a series of blog posts on our website that talk a little bit more about how the practice of knitting can also be seen as a way to meditate with your hands and so forth, and thinking about why knitting is beneficial. I hope that you will take an opportunity to do that as well. So let me just double check that I'm not blocking, nothing's blocking the shot, right, Maddie? Is it
Yep,
okay?
you're
Okay,
all good.
great. So the creative expression approach, and really why we do what we do, is thinking about arts and health and thinking about arts as really transformational, really thinking about how we use creative expression to not just provide comfort for ourselves, but also to create community. I really enjoy the Foundation for Arts and Healing talks a lot about how we can prevent loneliness, which is a very detrimental health factor for many people, and really creating a approach through the Foundation for Art and Healing and this website that you can dig into, I think is really important to keep in mind. So to kick off the conversation, I want to dig into how to choose the right yarn for your project. So the very first step when we're thinking about planning out our project is you're going to pick the yarn type and the correct needle size. And that is really the first step to success. So if I click into this particular article, it talks a lot about how starting a new craft can feel like you're learning a new language, you're gathering all the tools and the resources that you need to be successful. And my hope is that we'll touch on a number of different ways that you can think about how you can be even more successful and advance your project work, and to think about doing things that might be outside of your box. So it's really beneficial to us to try new things. And the nice part about knitting is that there are hundreds of different ways to engage and try different techniques and patterns. And that's the wonderful part about it. It's seemingly endless, really. So choosing the right yarn and thinking about all the different yarn sizes and types, 1, 2, and 3 ply. So this would be lace weight and below. 4 ply, which is fingering weight, which you'd find very commonly in hand-dyed yarn, many times lightweight shawls, and you're going to use needle sizes usually that match with the particular yarn size. But sometimes there's a technique of intentionally using a needle size that's larger to create a very lacy sheer fabric, or to use a needle that's much smaller to create a really dense fabric. So sometimes you're intentionally changing the size of your yarn and the size of your needle to think through the type of fabric that you're trying to create. Do you want something that's loose and gauzy, or something really tight and durable, like the heel of a sock? So DK weight stands for double knitting. That's something that I learned recently. And the reason for that is that it's double the weight of a 4 ply. So a DK is roughly double the size of a normal fingering weight yarn. Aran weight is a little bit larger than worsted weight. Aran is a word that is very frequently used in the United Kingdom, and the measurement of these needles obviously is in millimeters, which is also not necessarily the US size needles. So we could talk a little bit more about needle size later on as well. And then chunky is even bigger than Aran weight, and super chunky and big or jumbo size is even larger. So you get a gauge for the size of the needle and the size of the yarn that you're using. It's very important to think about how to pair up those particular measurements. So on to the way that the yarn weights are categorized here in the United States. These are the industry standard yarn measurements. So you have 1 through 7, and it gives you a gauge for what type of yarn are you looking at when you go to a store and you're looking at that particular yarn. These numbers can sometimes be confused with needle size, and that is not necessarily the case. So it is not the case. So typically, like a size 4 would be on a size US 8 needle, and then it would vary depending on your particular personal gauge, whether or not you're plus or minus 2 needle sizes. I happen to knit very tight. So I am typically knitting, if the range is 7 to 9, I'm almost always a 6 or at least a 7. So needle size is really based on each individual. And that's important to keep in mind when you're taking gauge. There will be a suggested needle size, but it will really depend on the individual knitter whether or not that matches with what works best for your particular fabric. So yarn substitution, this is a really great website, Yarn Sub. If you're looking at a pattern and you don't have access to that particular yarn, this website will give you yarns that are equivalent in gauge and bounce and all of those different factors that you're looking to substitute a particular yarn for. It can also help with any discontinued yarns that are no longer available. So it's really easy to search and a great tool to substitute. And sometimes that's the hardest part of planning a project, is picking the yarn that will work best for that particular pattern. And sometimes that's the key to success, is making sure that you have yarn that really matches well with the structure of the garment and the drape of that particular item that you're looking for. So this website in particular from Stitch and Story, I'm going to open this up, is really a wonderful resource on reading your knitting. So we all know that once you get the basic stitch done, there will always be something that comes up that could be a little bit tricky. So being familiar with the structure of your stitches and identifying what stitch you are on. So not just counting, but being able to tell that there's a purl bead there or a knit stitch there. Understanding what you've already completed, especially when it comes to ribbing or cables and so forth, and then knowing where you're going next with that particular pattern. And then being able to locate mistakes and then fix them. So we're going to do a little bit of picking up some mistake stitches later on. But the basic structure of a knitted fabric, they're calling it stocking stitch. You might refer to it as stockinette stitch and garter stitch. Those are the two primary basic fabrics that you would create. And on each of the rows of stockinette stitch, there are loops, and each loop is a separate row. So as you move through a series of loops, it looks like almost like a ladder that's building on itself. And each of the stockinette stitch rows are one row of knit and then one row of purl, back and forth, back and forth. So knit one row, purl one row. And as you go back and forth, you're creating a series of loops that are all coming through the front. And you can see that in this picture where they highlighted the loops are always pulled through the front. So if you had a drop stitch or a stitch that was reversed, you could ladder back and pick those back up by and we'll do a little bit of that on camera later on too. So when you're looking at the knit stitch on the right side, each of the rows, you can see V's. So the V is the base of the stitch on the stockinette stitch. On the opposite side of stockinette stitch, there are purl bumps, or what I like to call purl beads. And at the base of each stitch is what looks like a bead. And each of those beads is the back side of stockinette, or the front and back of garter stitch will look like a bead or a pearl bead. So the bumps are at the base of each stitch. And if you're taking gauge, you're counting each of those stitches. Either you're counting each of the V's or you're counting each of the bumps. And the bump is a complete, I think there's a picture of the bumps down here at the bottom. The bump is a complete three pack. So you can count, and then you will always count. Your 3-pack is on the stitch here, but you'll always count that final row as well. So these ridges are almost like loops that hang on top of each other. And if you think of it as the reverse of that V, those ridges are in little 3-packs as you count each of the cast on edges. So if you're counting rows, you're paying close attention to the gauge and the length of the garment. If you're counting the columns, you're looking at the width or the girth of your garment. And those are two very, very important measurements. And when your stitches are sitting on the needle size is giving you the width of each of those stitches. So how the stitches sit on your needle is a really important piece of what you're doing, because you don't want your stitches to get twisted. And I think of it as the leading edge of your loop should always be on the right side of the needle. So if you think of it as a horse, or you're mounting a horse and there's legs on both sides, the right hand leg of the stitch will always be on the top. So the top meaning the stitch, the part of the stitch that's closest to you on top of the needle. So it's sometimes easy when you are picking stitches back up to not quite know which direction that particular loop is sitting. And that's when you can lay it flat, just like you see here, and you can pick up the right side and make sure that it's on the top of the left side needle. So there's some videos that can help with that as well that I've linked in here that can help you really see that visual, and we'll do some of that on camera too. So I talked a little bit about counting the V's, and this is what shows you the counts of those particular for gauge swatching. So reading your knitting, I think, is one of the most important things that you can do to make sure that you're headed in the right direction and everything is working out as planned. And we'll do a gauge swatch when we go back to the camera. But I really enjoyed embedding some links that I've saved over the years of things that I think are really good tips. And this one in particular. So now you've picked your yarn. You've thought through the size of the needle that you're going to use, and now you're thinking about, how will I cast on, and what is the best cast on method? There are hundreds of different ways to cast on, and this is my favorite way to cast on. I'm going to show you this short video on, and it gives a pretty good explanation for it.
Things I wish I had known when I first started knitting. A simple, stretchy cast-on that anyone can do. This is what's called a cable cast-on, and it begins with a simple slip knot on your left-hand needle. We're going to work into the slip knot, knit it, and then this new loop that's on the right-hand needle is going to get put over here on the left, but I like to twist it and pop it on like that. From this point on, what we're going to do is go right the way in the middle between the first and second stitch. So pop the right hand needle in there. You're doing a knitting motion to bring the new loop through, and then twisting it and popping it onto the left hand needle. In the middle, in between those two stitches, wrapping the yarn around as if to knit, bringing it back through and popping it on to the left hand needle. And this will give you a nice stretchy cast on with a lovely ropey edge. See our profile for lots more tips just like this.
So I particularly like that edge because it's so easy and so stretchy, and it stays really, really nice on the total edge of the knitting as a whole. You have a really tight but stretchy edge to whatever garment you're starting out with. So casting on is one of the most important pieces, and there's so many different ways to do that as well. So keeping that in mind as you go through is really an important part of the process. So measuring your finished gauge, we talked about the rows, and we talked about how you would, when you're taking gauge, many times people will recommend that you take it over at least 2 inches, but ideally something like 4 inches would be even better, because it will give you a chance to divide by 4 and really get a gauge for exactly what your stitch count will look like over the length of the garment. So even a half stitch could really increase the size of your garment over the entire circumference of your overall piece. So thinking about finished gauge and thinking about how to obtain gauge, very important that you block whatever it is that you're measuring, because blocking will really allow all the stitches to even out, lay flat, and not be quite, they will kind of blossom if it's a really woolly yarn especially. So a gauge swatch can be very, very different in measurement before you wet block it and after. So it is important to keep that in mind as you go through. This article in particular does a nice job of laying out how you can stack your gauge swatches. So in this case, they were intentionally taking 3 different size needles and taking a gauge swatch of each of them over the length of the garment, or the sample that swatch that they've made. So it's good to think about if your gauge is off, what should you do about it? And really, you can't change your tension in your hands necessarily that easily, but you can change the size of your needle. And that really is the easiest thing to go up and down. I would say plus or minus 2 to 3 needle sizes is completely acceptable. I think sometimes people will read a pattern and they'll say it calls for size 8, I have to use size 8, but that's not necessarily the case. And the range of needle sizes that people use is quite large. So keeping that in mind is, I think, an important part of the process. So another really interesting, Tin Can Knits recently came out with this blog post about swatching your color work and getting a gauge for color work by extending that particular, let's see if there's a good picture of it, extending your color work with a useful swatch that you can make a hat out of your useful swatch. I think that's really great, because sometimes people are hesitant to swatch because they feel like it's wasted time, but you could use your swatch as a hat or a sleeve. And I think swatching on the needles, like as you go, can be a nice way to play with the color combinations as well. So in this case, they were swatching in the round off the main garment. So that's a really good opportunity for you to continue to knit and not feel like you're wasting effort. So you can swatch within the particular garment that you're working on. And that's a really great article. The Strange Brew series on Tin Can Knits does a really nice job of explaining exactly what it takes to lay out a particular pattern. So grafting, there was a great question from the audience that talked about, I have a garment that got caught on a zipper and now it has sort of a strange hole, and there are so many ways to fix that. Visible mending would be one of them, but grafting is probably the easiest thing to do if it's something where it's very obviously on a piece of the a row, or if it's on a piece of the knitting itself. Grafting would be the least visible solution. And grafting is also a way to discover the anatomy of a stitch and to really think about what the stitches look like to make it essentially an invisible seam. And I know there's grafting for plants, and different hobbies use the word grafting in different ways. But I thought some of these pictures are really great at showcasing, like, this is a specific row. This is one row of knitting. So in order to graft these two sides together, they intentionally cut out to get the live stitches on both sides. And then they graft the particular, the same pattern that you see here is the stockinette stitch. So it works, I think, really well to trace a single row. And this article also talks about the direction of that particular yarn, right? So this is your leading edge. And that leading edge means that that's the first part of the stitch that comes up and out. And that would be on the top of the needle. When you put the needle back in, you want it straddling with with essentially the top being your leading left leg on the top. And sometimes it's interesting when I'm working with people that are new to knitting, left and right is different for people when they're knitting. Some people think of it as they're straddling their needle. So left is on one side of the needle and right is on the other. And some people think of it as I'm facing my knitting and left is on the left side of their hand and the right is on the right side of the hand. So it's a little bit tricky for us to say left and right when we're working with folks because everyone sees it a little bit differently. So I would usually call this the leading edge of the yarn and the leading edge of that particular stitch. So the columns that are created when you're knitting, you're always going in from behind. And you can see here what I was talking about with the leading edge being on the top of the needle. And in grafting, in this particular case, they're starting to go into the third needle so that they can graft the previous stitch back and forth to weave in their ends. And we'll talk about weaving in the ends here in a second as well. So they're going down the line and creating an opportunity for these new stitches to extend and have a single extra loop on the edges too. So this article, I think, does a wonderful job of explaining exactly what grafting looks like. Really, the anatomy of the stitch is really obvious from these pictures, and I think really helpful to see. And really, the underlying principle of grafting is that it would be completely invisible. And the same goes for garter stitch, which it explains as well. So it's a good opportunity to do a very not visible way of combining your stitches. There's also false grafting. So this is if you don't have live stitches available, what would that look like? And false grafting can be somewhat invisible as well because you're creating essentially a seam where that particular seam is sometimes in the underarm, but you're reversing it so that the back of those stitches are tucked into the back, just like if you were sewing a garment, the seam would be on the inside. It's the same for the false grafting as well. But I like that it gives you an opportunity to pick up stitches that have already been cast off, or maybe you're working on a hole in the garment where it's not clear that there are live stitches available. So grafting gives you an opportunity to pick up those stitches and almost invisibly mend them on the front, but then on the back you can see that the wrong side has a seam that's hidden in the back. So that's a great link to check out. So I get a lot of questions on the best way to weave in your ends. So there are so many different patterns that, excuse me for a second here, sorry about that. So many different patterns that allow for different ways to weave in the ends, but you always want to think about keeping your fabric stretchy, right? So there are lots of people that believe that we should never tie knots in our knitting. And the ways in which we weave in our ends are essentially allowing the fabric to remain mobile, but allowing those ends to not come loose. And my favorite method is what you see here, where you go into the side of that particular needle, or that you take your needle up the side of those particular stitches and then up the opposite direction. And as long as you go in a V shape or a V format like that, it remains stable, but it doesn't pull your fabric in weird directions. This V is maybe more spread out than I would typically do, but it is nice that it would blend in from the back fairly easily. It depends on the type of yarn, what the best way to weave in is. And I think using a nice needle, like one of these sharp tapestry needles for some of the ways that we weave in can really help. And always going diagonally, I think really helps. There are some ways that people highlight that aren't necessarily diagonal, but I think that it really helps to go in a diagonal, just like you see here. So you're essentially picking up just the tail edge of those particular loops, and then you're going the opposite direction, same thing. And you can see that they split the plies a little bit, and that's totally fine because you're just essentially tucking it into the back, and you don't want it to be visible from the front. So in this case, the front of that loop, it would stay relatively stable, and you wouldn't see it. You wouldn't see it really very well on either side, which is nice. And then you can cut it really close to the fabric. And if it came loose, you could always snip it down again, and it wouldn't pucker the fabric, and it's barely visible really on either side. It talks a little bit about like when you're knitting with a slippery yarn or a cotton yarn, there are other methods that would work better for that particular, for those particular. And then it talks about how to get it on the rib edge. So going up and then back down on a rib, because you wouldn't want to go diagonal over those different size stitches. Same thing where you can go up and back down. And again, you would barely see it. It would just be slightly bulkier. For garter stitch, you can do a duplicate stitch through the top. And then you can go back and over the opposite direction underneath. And that works pretty well. It does sometimes, garter stitch is tricky because you really don't want to pull it too tightly, but you can see how it runs in between, and it's not very conspicuous, which is nice. And then knitting in the cast on tail, so the very cast on edge of your item, you would knit that, you can double knit that particular stitch to allow that to hide it more easily on the tail edge. This article does a good job of explaining like the double knitting and weaving in your ends as you knit. I think that's really useful to do because some projects require you to pick up like the tail edge anyway. So it's great to do it as you go along. And I think the felted join and the essentially different methods for very natural fibers where you can actually felt the yarn together. That's really, really very useful. In this particular case, this single ply bulky, that was very easy for them to wet felt it together. And you can do that even with needle felting, with barbed needles that are used to carry those wool fibers together and to make them interlock really, really. It's amazing how quickly you can felt something like that and really make it very, very tight. Hiding tails in the seams, so going up and down the edge. So this article really is dense with information on different ways to seam in an invisible way, just like that false grafting that I mentioned earlier. Very similar to mattress stitch, which is essentially going back and forth in the same pattern to really create a clean edge on both sides. And knitting intarsia, obviously you would have lots of ways in which you need to bind the colors together, and hiding those ends is really key to that. So I'll go back to, so that is there, that article has 10 techniques on different ways to weave in your ends. And I think they do a really great job. Nimble Needles is really wonderful. All right, so this is the controversial piece that I brought up before. So the magic knot is something that a lot of people swear by when it comes to if you have a very uh, very slippery cotton yarn, like in this case, this is a linen yarn, and there's really no other way to graft those yarns pieces together without it being really visible. The magic knot is sometimes your only solution. And I think that this video does a great job of showing you exactly what that looks like. So I'll go ahead and play that really quickly. So that is the tightest knot you'll ever come by. I don't know if we have any sailors in the batch, but there are so many different sailing knots and so forth. But this particular knot and the way that you layer it on top and then pull those ends through the 2 layers of those loops, that knot is not going to ever come loose, and you can cut it off right at the edge of the knot. And especially in this tiny fingering or almost lace weight yarn, that little bobble will really disappear. So I sometimes think that the magic knot is a good solution. If it's not yarn that you can felt, and it's not yarn that would be easy for you to weave in, or let's say the pattern doesn't lend itself well to that, the magic knot is a really good solution for that. So I had another question about how do I know the right side from the wrong side on my knitting? And my best piece of advice for that is to mark the right side with a stitch marker as you get started. And I do that on almost every garment that I use. Or I use a stitch marker to just put the right side, and I use that stitch marker also as a progress keeper. So I know how much I've completed in a certain batch of time and so forth. But the other strategy that you can do is your right side will typically have your cast on tail on the right side. So when you lay it down on the table, in this case, you can really tell the right side from the wrong side because you can see the stockinette V's are the right side and the purl bumps are the wrong side. But there are many patterns and many ways in which you can't necessarily see that. So in this case, the only indicator would be the cast on tail, which you see right here, will be on the right side of your item. Now, if you're in the round, it's much harder to determine that. So it wouldn't necessarily work as easily. And that's when I really recommend putting a stitch marker on the right side, just in case, especially if you're circular needles, if you're putting it in a bag and it could get reversed, it's really important to mark those front sides as best you can. And especially when you're getting started on unique patterns or stitches that you haven't tried before, I think it can be really helpful to mark it. But if you can look at if you're knitting flat, you can always look to the right side, which will have your cast on tail on the right. So problem solving is a big piece of what knitters do, right? And I like to think of all mistakes in knitting can be fixed. And one of the best parts about knitting is that you can always tink back, right? Tink is knit spelled backwards. And I just think that that is one of the most charming words when it comes to what we're up to with knitting. So to tink back is always an option. And I think that's important to keep in mind, that anything that you repeat over many stitches is also a technique. So sometimes people will talk about twisted stitches, and sometimes that's really intentional. So I think it's good to keep that in mind. These are some common mistakes and possible reasons why. So you may have too many stitches on your needle, which means that you did an unintentional increase, or you might have a hole in your knitting, which might mean that you had an extra yarn over. There are a lot of reasons why and a lot of ways to fix that as you go through. And one of the things that many times people will find that in many cases, it's because of the direction of the yarn. So if your yarn is supposed to sit in the back, or if it's supposed to sit in the front, you want to make sure on the purls it's in the front, and on the knit side it's always in the back. Too few stitches. So this could mean that you accidentally knit two together, or the plies came together in some way. Knitting too tight. So many times this is because people will knit at the very tip or the very edge of their needle. Knitting too loose could be that they were using, they weren't pulling snug enough. They didn't have any tension on their yarn. I don't usually hold tension, and I've been knitting for a really long time, but because I really like to, I knit English style, and I really like to get my tension with each loop that I make. So it's important to keep that in mind as you knit. Keeping that consistent is really an important part of the process. Splitting the yarn ply. So many yarns are easily stranded, or the yarn plies are easily separated. So you want to make sure that you're getting into the full backside of each of the strands, and that you're not allowing the twist of those plies to come loose, because it's really easy to do that, especially with really a lot of needles are either really sharp or really dull, and using the right point to a needle for the right type of yarn can help you prevent those splits from happening. So this website in particular, I think, does a really great job of explaining all of the different types of projects that might come up, slipping purlwise. It has some examples of adding stitches and dropping stitches. I'm going to do this. We're going to do some of that together here shortly. Time is flying. Same with verypink.com. Great video tutorials to go back through and review some patterns that match with the different techniques as well. I really enjoy this woman on Instagram in particular does a lot of visible mending as well, which I mentioned earlier. But this is a very great review of what we're going to talk about with picking up a drop stitch, which many times you'll hear people refer to it as laddering back. So if you have a stitch that's been dropped, or a stitch that it has been reversed, so you have a little purl bump hiding in your stockinette, you can intentionally ladder back and go through and pick them up with a crochet hook. And the way that she does it is always very, very meditative. Bokau is, she does a lot of needle felting as well. But I want to show this to you as she goes back. So you can see how that entire row has come loose. So she is intentionally picking up from the back, coming up through the stockinette. So it's coming, you can see the leading edge of that particular stitch, and she's coming all the way up. I once took a class in correcting mistakes, and they gave us swatches with intentional mistakes that we had to fix. And I have to say, it's quite fun to see. Look at that. It looks like magic, right? So it's really fun to see it come back together and to see the fabric smooth out. When it looks like it's in complete disarray, you can always fix it. So I think that that's a good lesson. And she also does a lot of visible mending as well, which is really fun to watch. So this is one tool that I'm going to showcase to you here in a second, which I think is really wonderful. They are by a company, Floops, and the tool is called a Flox, which is Floop Flox is really hard to say, but it essentially is a multi-tool. You can use it as a drop stitch fixer, a cable needle, a stitch marker. I think of it as kind of like a magical all-in-one tool, very flexible. I'll show it to you here in a second as well. And then we'll talk a little bit about the stitch dictionary when I'm done. So I'm going to stop my share. And let's see, are there any questions, Maddie, while I transfer over to the other camera? Anything
I don't think there are any specific knitting questions. I know Sandy posted just that she's working on a sweater with 3 sets of needles for double knitting, which sounds, I mean, as myself not being a knitter, I was already stressed by hearing about that. But
or maybe awe, right?
yes, exactly. And yes, in awe for sure, but also stressing myself out, I think too.
Yes. Yes. Well, double points are actually something I was going to talk about. So I don't know if you're using like traditional double point needles, but I have really enjoyed, I've started using, there are many versions of this, but these are well, everything is a fluke, right? So these are the Addy, oh gosh, what are they called? Flexi floops. Oh my gosh, now I'm forgetting the name of them, but they are double point needles that have a bend to them, which makes it really easy to knit in the round. I've always used traditional double points, but now I am flexi flips. These are the flexi flips. They're all the companies have them now. And I found them really, really handy at preventing any gaps in between and really easy circular needle knitting. So that's kind of a fun piece that I don't know if she's had a chance to try those out, but they work really, really well. So this is the flocks that I was talking about. You can see how it bends. Let me see if I can get a better angle on this. And the best part is you can use it as a stitch marker. You can lock it over itself. It has really nice tips. It doesn't have a hook on it, so that's where the crochet hook comes in to pick up the lost edge on your particular project. So I wanted to touch on the question that we had about, it's hard for me to tell which side of the project I'm on. And that's really important when you're doing stockinette stitch in particular, because in this case, I was doing garter stitch, garter stitch, garter stitch. And then I intentionally showcased what would happen if I did a row of purl and then a row of knit again. I would start into stockinette stitch. And this row of purl beads, right? So I've got 2 rows of stockinette and then a row of purl, 2 rows of knit, and it's starting in on stockinette. So if I needed to take that out, I could. I could also check out the back and that would guarantee, or it would essentially confirm for me that I have 2 garter purl bump rows without anything in between. I think it's a little tricky to see. There we go. So you've got 2 rows of purl bumps instead of having the V's in between, which is what you really are supposed to have for traditional garter stitch. You can really see it when I spread it out. And you can see how these 2 rows are really close together on the end there. So, so let's see, how much time do I have? Are there any specific questions about the gauge swatching? I wanted to showcase. So essentially when you gauge swatch, you're going to go over 4 inches and you're going to measure each individual row. And I like to count it by actually touching each of the V's. So you'd go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. So it's essentially at 2 inches, I've got a 9.5. And that's why it would be beneficial to count it out to 4 so that you have a more accurate count across all of the stitches. In this particular case, then you would also do your gauge swatch on the column and you would measure it based on the tip of each of the V's. Same thing, counting up as you go. And there are some gauge swatches where you don't necessarily have to flip it and it's a square too, which is really handy. And it's important not to stretch it though, right? You want it to lay exactly how it would naturally lay and have it be blocked and even. So, so any questions on the gauge swatch or pieces I can tell you about more there? Let's check the, let's see if I can get this to come up at the same time here. Excellent. So the nice part about the way that these gauge swatches are, I laid out a couple of different gauge swatches for you to see what it would look like to, you can also knit in different patterns that are specifically designed to keep track of those purl bumps versus the stockinette bumps. So as you go down the line, again, with those threesomes, so each of those is a stitch and another stitch here and another stitch there. I'm going to go ahead, since we have 10 minutes left, and I'm going to go ahead and show you the stitch dictionary, because I think we can showcase some of the really interesting tidbits from that. The nice part about the way that they share in the Vogue Knitting Stitch Dictionary, for instance, there are lots of different stitch dictionaries out there. But the nice part about it is that there are so many new techniques to learn, right? This was a fun blog article from 2021 about different techniques to learn throughout that particular year. I thought that was a fun way to master a new skill. But one of the most important things, and when I was looking at the gauge swatch that I have here, it's so difficult to carry your yarn out the side. So this jogless knitting, when you're in the round, and Patty Lyons is a wonderful teacher and really inspires a lot of the, she has a bag of tricks and a lot of ways to ensure that you can fix mistakes. But this jogless striping I thought was really brilliant. So I want to show you this really quick.
Everybody loves stripes, but in the round, they can be not so pretty. Here I have joined a new ball and I've knit one round of the blue. And if I continue along my merry way to the second round without doing anything special, you can see not so pretty. You get the dreaded jog. So let's look at my favorite jogless join for a stripe that is 2 rows or wider. You're always going to knit one full round without doing anything special. Now, when you get back to the end of the round, and here I am, the first stitch I knit with my new color, I'm going to insert the tip of the right needle back to front into the row below, into the old color, lift that up onto the needle. Now knit them together with the row below and finish the round. I'm going to finish up the round and let's take a look at what it looks like. And there you go. Knit a couple of rounds of green over it so you can see. But there is our jogless join. Pretty darn good and so incredibly simple to do.
So that's exactly the kind of fix that I think is really brilliant. Simple, very straightforward. You're picking up that extra piece of that bottom row to even it out and to make it look like there's less of a jag, right? Those the jog, as they call it, is really easy to overcome in that circumstance. So I think that that's one of the things that it looks like a mistake. It isn't necessarily a mistake, but it's something that's easy to overcome and to make your knitting look even better. This particular pattern, I put in some interesting little tidbits on different, these are cables, which are actually shockingly easy. So I don't know how many of you have tried cables in the past, or if you know what it's like. I want to show you this. This is just a very quick video that will showcase, let's see if it'll cooperate here. It'll showcase what cabling looks like. And it's very, very straightforward. If you haven't tried it, I hope this will inspire you to try it. The way in which the cable comes about is this is the cable needle that she's going to hold in the back. You are either holding your cable needle in the back or the front. So she's just holding those 3 stitches on that needle that's hanging out in the back. She's knitting across and then knitting across the other needle. And that is all there is to cabling. So if you haven't tried it, I would really encourage you to try it. It provides great texture And it doesn't get any easier. It's truly, cabling is one of those techniques that I think you could teach a beginner and they would just be so thrilled. Typically on cables, there's some sort of purl edge in between to make some of it sink down in between, like you saw her just do a purl. And now she's going to do it again. She's going to slide those 3 stitches. And in this case, she's going to hold it in the back again. And sometimes you'll hold it in the front if you need your particular yarn to stay towards the front. And now she's going to knit off the cable needle. So it's really, really straightforward. And for those of you that haven't tried cabling, I hope that gives you a chance to see really, truly how easy it is. Another really great stitch, the herringbone stitch. Some of these have very loud music. This is one of my all-time favorites and very, very straightforward. Knitting into the back. And just 1 stitch falling off. Knit into the back, with 2, 1 stitch off. And then the same thing on the end. And you'll do the same thing on the purl side as you go across. And it really is such a cool texture and so straightforward. And that's the herringbone stitch. Really, really a fun one. I think that you then purl to the end. And I think it's neat because it's cool on both sides. Isn't that great? So the herringbone stitch, I'd really encourage you to give it a shot. It's really great texture too. So when you're using a particular yarn, I think it's really, really fun. This one I really love. I'm not sure if everyone will love it. It's a decorative stitch that I think looks like fans or feathers. Let's see if I can get this one to play for you. So they very much look like almost like little fluffy clouds or almost like baubles. But look at how they do this. They count down. And you can count down as many, you can make them as big or as small as you'd like. And you pull up, so you see how they're going in between the stitches. They're getting a whole chain of them lined up all the way up to the top. And I've seen it done with 3s. I've seen it done with 10. And then they just literally strong arm it over the top. And again, with each of the stitches, and this video might be a little bit confusing because they're double stranded on, they're using 2 strands of yarn, and you wouldn't necessarily have to do that, but it does create even more cool texture. Isn't that cool? I was so excited. I just really can't wait to, and I did a hat like that, and it was just really nice to have little decorative stitches that look like little feathers throughout. So that's a really fun one. Very, very straightforward. And then another one that's very similar to that is almost the same in some respects, but you're using it across. So they're pulling that yarn all the way across the horizontal edge. They're slipping 3 in the front, then doing the same thing all the way across. And it's really very straightforward. When you break it down, it couldn't be any easier. And these stitches all have different names. Like the last 2 aren't really named stitches. From what I could tell in the stitch dictionary, they are called different things by different designers and different folks. So, but you can watch these videos on the Padlet if you want to give it a try. And the fun part about stitches like this is you can integrate them into any pattern, any basic hat pattern that you have. It's just a nice way to add more texture. So the baubles are the last piece, and there's so many different ways to knit baubles, but this particular way is so straightforward. And this video is sort of sped up. And you're going to knit into the front and the back. And baubles are similar in some respects to cables because you're slipping stitches back onto the needle and then stitching into them again. So they're going back through the same 4 stitches and then transferring them back and doing the same pass through again. And then you're looping them over each other to keep your stitch count the same. So those bobbles are really straightforward. There's some bobbles that have twists in them and so forth, but these are really great, very straightforward bobbles. So I also list some of the resources that I plug into quite often for beginner knitters, especially. There's some really great tips on fixing some of those common mistakes and really easy to digest videos for beginner knitters on the skill set book from Modern Daily Knitting. Their YouTube channel is fabulous and really great way to plug in. And Patty Lyons, who I mentioned earlier, who showed us the jogless join for those stripes. Her book of, the tricks of the trade, and her tips that she has, her bag of tricks, which she is currently, I think, on tour promoting her new book. She was just here at Fiberspace in Alexandria. That is a fabulous series of videos that she's been highlighting. But this link is fun because it gives you patterns that match those particular tricks that she's teaching you. And then Arnie and Carlos, this article from Modern Daily Knitting talks a little bit about how she felt like a new knitter trying these new techniques in Norwegian purling, which was something brand new to her and made her feel like her hands were really trying something brand new. And exercising your brain in a new way is something I hope that you will work on. And you'll always find a new rhythm with these new stitches and these new ways of doing things. And that's really what our ultimate goal is, to stretch our brains and to figure out ways to use our hands more. So any questions or anything I can share with you about? I'm so glad that you joined us. And yes, I apologize that some of the sites have scrolling advertisements. They that's a nice way for them to feel supported. So I apologize that if they bother you. The websites that are out there for knitters are real. There are so many options out there, and I hope that the Padlet itself will give you kind of a, I'll put the Padlet link in again, will give you kind of a way to narrow down all the resources that are out there. I also link to our Padlet that talks about the research related to knitting, so you can dig in there as well. There are hundreds of articles on that research page.
And I'll just jump in as we finish up here just to thank everyone again for coming, and thank you to Lauren for a fabulous presentation. I will share in the chat the link for our next event, which is scheduled for January 10th. It'll also be sent out via email tomorrow with any post-event resources, the links that Lauren shared, all that information. And it can also be found on our website calendar. But of course, you're always welcome at any point to reach out to me directly, and I'm happy to direct you anywhere that you need to go for any of that information. But thank you all again very much for joining us tonight.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thanks so much for coming.